Hello, everybody. This is MJ here. My final project is on the early fringe religious orders of Indiana, denominations, actually, of Indiana, the old Northwest Territory. While this is a religious class, I love to apply history to everything, and this is a bit of a history class, and I wanted to apply this history, westward expansion, the cultural aspects of it. And one of the great cultural aspects of it is the religious orders who chose to move away from the Eastern orders and denominations because they wanted to practice religion the way they wanted to. And two such groups that settled in Indiana for a short while, just a little over 10 years for each of them, are the Shakers, commonly known as the Shakers, and the Harmonists, or Rappites. The frontier of the old Northwest Territory in what became Indiana was ripe for salvation in this unforgiving land. It gave new commune-style religions. These were. They were commune-style, not communism, like would come later with Karl Marx or socialism. I saw one word for it was communite. So it's not the same as communism as you would think of it as, but it's basically what it was. They developed communes. These orders would sometimes develop even without buildings or any tools. So they would have a lot of services, if the weather was good enough outside, and especially in the Harmonists' case, they mass-produced buildings, and I'll get to that in a moment. With Harmony, Indiana, a very interesting place that actually still exists today. West Union, Indiana, which is where the Shakers developed, that did not continue. They were beset by absolutely horrible tragedies, from earthquake to tornadoes to sickness to finally flooding, wash it all away. And in a way, the Harmonists had some of those things. It turned out that it was just very rough living out in the middle of nowhere, as one would expect. But there are a lot of comparisons, and there are a lot of things that you cannot compare with the two. The Harmonists were millennials or millennialists, where they thought that God was coming back in their time. The Shakers were as well to a certain extent, but Mother Ann Lee, where it all started, she was more into visions. She was a bit of a prophet, and I'll get to her in a few moments. But I wanted to start out with the Harmonists. And the best place to start out is, one would think, with George Rapp. But actually, the best place to start off is in Harmony, Indiana. Harmony, Indiana started in 1814. Like the Shakers, they had some hardships. In 1814, people got sick pretty much right away. Malaria, and all building in the towns ceased. Luckily, they had figured out a way to mass-produce buildings, and so they could build houses quite quickly. 4 houses still exist today that were mass-produced there, and I'll get to those in a moment. They are the Ammon Clarence Thomas House, the Matthias Skola House, the Ludwig Eppel House, and the George Bentel House. Now, I bring these up because this is something I love about history, to see the history. New Harmony is still there, and these houses were from the Harmonist period of 1814 to 1824, before it was sold to the Owen family, which they actually did create what could be an actual commune that had some socialist ideals. But all these houses, along with 25 other buildings at 8 sites, are a part of the National Historic Landmark, are all landmarks, and so nothing can happen. They've only been reformed. But going to George Rapp, he's the one that started this. They had 12,000 members in the Duchy of Württemberg, before they were chased out of the duchy in the very late 1700s. Certain 1802 and 1803, their members started coming to the United States. They came to Pennsylvania first, but they did eventually settle in, like I said, in 1814 in what they called at the time Harmony, Indiana. Essentially, the Rappites or the Harmonists were Lutherans. They split from the church in 1785. Their millennialist attitudes were one of the big stumbling blocks. Celibacy, which is also an interesting thing because the Shakers were into celibacy as well. George Rapp thought of celibacy as it was the disharmony that started out of Adam and Eve, and they felt that by celibacy and confessing sins that they could bring the harmony back. Both groups developed their religions by adoption, and they were both pacifists as well. There really isn't a lot of comparison between George Rapp and Mother Ann Lee. Mother Ann Lee received visions and took just a small section of her group, the Shakers. And the Shakers' actual name is the Brethren, the United Society of Believers in Christ's second appearing. So they were millennialists as well. But the difference, like I said, between George Rapp and Mother Ann Lee was that Mother Ann Lee was receiving visions, or so she said. The comparisons, like I said, some disasters beset. With the Harmonists, it wasn't so bad. They wound up being they were just a little too far out and south. They were too far south of Vincennes. They were too far north of Kentucky, and other. The only ones that they could identify at all with were the Shakers, who were fairly nearby. It was just a ride up the Wabash River. Both sites, both West Union and Harmony, Indiana, were both on the Wabash River. The Harmonist site at Harmony was actually only about 10 miles north of the Ohio River. As for the West Union, had a real problem where they put their site at. Why they didn't get receive any help from Vincennes is beyond me. I think they probably just bypassed it. And so they settled there. The problem was they were on a war party trail. And so the War of 1812 was just getting ready to start. And so the war parties were coming through, the Native Americans, and so they created some havoc. After the War of 1812, that wasn't a problem. The other problems were that they had an earthquake in 1811, the New Madrid earthquake, pretty well wiped out West Union. They had sickness after that, but then in 1819, they had a tornado come through, and it wiped out the town again, followed by a flood in 1820, and that was pretty much the end of the Shaker settlement in Indiana. The Harvest site continued on until 1824. Again, they had the same problems. They were a bit far away from any civilization. Vincennes at the time, by the time of 1824, when the Harmony Society was ending, Vincennes was no longer the territorial capital. In fact, Indiana wasn't even a territory anymore. It was a capital, or it was a state, and the capital was at Corydon. And so that made it even worse. Vincennes was a nominal fort at best. So there wasn't a lot around there that they could build on. And so that's why they left in 1824. And in 1825, Robert Owen bought the site and made it a truer form of communism. They weren't, or socialism. They weren't a religious order. So we'll stop with the research there. But the Um, with the harmonists, they like I said, they believed in millennialism, but and that Christ would come back in their lifetime. But they also believed that Napoleon was the Antichrist. In fact, that's how they got to the point, to the thoughts that they were in the end time. With the with Mother Ann Lee, and then people after her, the Society of Shakers after her. In fact, it's funny because the Shakers are actually still around. There's two left, or so they say they're Shakers, but the society officially is defunct when the official society ended in the 1960s. But the interesting thing about George Rapp is he several times talked about a, a goddess named Sophia in his writings. He was into mysticism, and and this is another place where they kind of differ from the Shakers in that Mother Ann Lee was just seeing visions, and it was more of a kind of a religious type of thing. But with George Rapp, he really kind of went off a bit. The Virgin Spirit is sometimes what it was called, but it was always called Sophia, not the Virgin Mary or anything. So